First, we start with Henry Smith.
Question 1, sir.
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can confirm that negotiations have begun. Officials from the UK and Mauritius met at the end of last month and had constructive discussions. The UK and Mauritius have reiterated that any agreement will ensure the continued effective operation of the joint UK-US defence facility on Diego Garcia, and we will be meeting again to continue negotiations shortly.
Henry Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What consultations are being held with members of the Chagossian community in my Crawley constituency and around the UK ahead of any proposed changes to the British Indian Ocean Territory?
Secretary of State.
I recognise my honourable friend's championing of the Chagossian community in his constituency, and he'll recognise there is a diversity of views in the various Chagossian communities in Mauritius, in the UK and in the Seychelles. We will, of course, take those views very, very seriously. But the negotiations, of course, are between the UK and Mauritius. We will ensure that we continue to engage with those communities through this negotiating process.
Patrick Ready.
Mr. Speaker, does the UK Government now accept the finding of the International Court of Justice that the process of decolonisation of Mauritius was not lawfully completed in 1968 and that the UK's continued administration of the Chagos Archipelago constitutes a wrongful act?
Secretary of State.
The UK has expressed regret about the manner in which the Chagossians were removed in the late 1960s and the 1970s. But we are working constructively with the Mauritius government, and as I say, one of the strong principles that underpins the negotiation is the reiteration that the UK and US defence facility on Diego Garcia will continue.
Dan Carden.
Question number 2, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
Ministers and senior officials have raised the UK's position with regard to LGBT plus football fans and the status of those fans in Qatar. I raise these issues regularly in my direct engagement with the Qatari authorities, and on my recent visit to Qatar, again it was reinstated in the conversation I had between myself and my opposite number in the Foreign Ministry.
Dan Carden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the Foreign Secretary. Qatar has brought into focus the denial of people's basic rights over their sexuality and gender. Around 70 countries still criminalise homosexuality, with 10 or more using the death penalty still. Yet we're seeing a regression for LGBT rights in many parts of the world. Last week in Russia, Putin criminalised any act of public mention of same-sex relationships. In parts of Eastern Europe, LGBT people are facing regression. Violence in Bulgaria, new anti-LGBT laws in Hungary, and so-called LGBT ideology-free zones continue to operate in Poland. What is the Foreign Secretary doing to ensure that we don't see a pink curtain descend across Europe?
The honourable gentleman raises incredibly important points. My position on the importance of promoting and defending the rights of LGBTQ plus people is well known. That absolutely reflects the British government's position on this. We do not shy away from raising these issues in the conversations we have with those relevant countries where there are issues and where we are seeing a slip backwards, and I can commit to him and the House that we will continue to do so.
Swain.
A proportion of the gay and lesbian community in Qatar will statistically also be part of the Christian minority. And Qatar has one of the worst records in the world for persecution of Christians. What's he going to do about that?
Secretary of State.
Again, the British government has a long-standing commitment to the protection of freedom of religion or belief. We report on this regularly. The Prime Minister has in the past appointed a special envoy for this issue. My ministerial friend, Lord Ahmed, in the other place, champions this when he has conversations in this region. And again, the protection of minorities is an issue which is brought up regularly in the conversations I have in the region.
Chris Elmore.
Number 3, sir.
Mr. Speaker, with permission, I will answer questions 3 and 6 together. The UK has led diplomatic efforts to refer the situation in Ukraine to the International Criminal Court. With the US and the EU, we established the Atrocities Crime Advisory Group, and we are working closely with our international partners to ensure that our sanctions are effective and those that are responsible for atrocities and breaches of international humanitarian law at whatever level are ultimately held accountable for their actions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Foreign Secretary for his answer. In her recent visit to Parliament, the First Lady of Ukraine highlighted that Russian soldiers had carried out sexual violence, including rape on Ukrainian women, with the consent of their commanders. Under the UN international law, as he will be aware, the use of rape in combat is a war crime. Could the Foreign Secretary specifically set out what he will be doing on the diplomatic stage to ensure that when the war is over, or indeed before, that those soldiers who committed those crimes and those officers who authorised that disgusting and heinous rapes towards women are dealt with in the International Criminal Court?
He raises an incredibly important point. I had the opportunity, the privilege to speak with the First Lady at the Preventing Sexual Violence conference that we hosted in London recently. I can inform him and the House that this morning we designated 12 more Russian military officers who are in command of Russian troops where atrocities have taken place. We work closely with the Ukrainian Chief Prosecutor, the International Criminal Court and our international allies on ensuring there is an accountability framework that is effective from the people on the ground who are perpetrating these crimes directly, through those officers who are ordering them to do so, right up to and including Vladimir Putin himself, ultimately who is responsible for this vile acts that are taking place because of his invasion of Ukraine.
Andrew Selou.
Does the Foreign Secretary agree that prosecutions and sanctions for atrocities in Ukraine should also be extended to those in Russia who perpetrate violence against women and girls, such as the Russian police officer Ivan Ryabov, who tortured courageous Russian women for speaking out against the brutality done in their name but against their will in Ukraine?
Foreign Secretary.
My honourable friend makes an incredibly important point that there are many, many Russians deeply opposed to the invasion that Putin initiated against Ukraine. Their bravery is legion. We have sanctioned over 1,200 Russians as a direct result of Putin's invasion, over 120 entities. I will take on board, I will make note of the name that he raised. He and I have discussed this previously. He will understand that we don't comment on specific designations that might be brought about.
Shadow Foreign Secretary, David Lamley.
Mr. Speaker, Labour has called for a special tribunal to prosecute Putin personally since March. This is a necessary part of securing justice for the victims of Putin's war crime, as well as adding to the legal basis for confiscating frozen Russian assets. The EU has already set out a plan to shift frozen assets into a fund to help rebuild Ukraine. Canada has already passed laws to do it. Why isn't the government doing the same?
Foreign Secretary.
The government, I have committed to explore ways of ensuring that those individuals who supported Vladimir Putin, those kleptocrats and oligarchs who've helped fund this aggression against Ukraine, are not just sanctioned, but ultimately we look at mechanisms that need to be robust, legally robust, to seize assets as part of the reparations, the rebuilding and reconstruction phase. We of course work closely with the Canadian authorities. They have a similar legal system to ours for obvious reasons, and we will explore what they have done to see what we can learn to make sure that whatever vehicle we put in place has the desired effect and is robust.
Hilary Benn.
Question number 4.
Foreign Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, with permission, I will answer questions 4 and 13 together. Fixing the Northern Ireland Protocol is a top priority for this government. Since September, I have been in regular contact with Vice President Šefčovič. We last spoke on the 1st of December, and I'll be seeing him for further talks this week. My officials have also been working with our counterparts in the EU on a regular basis to try and resolve the issues which we recognise, and we're impressing upon them, are causing serious, genuine and damaging friction in relationships between the various communities in Northern Ireland.
I'm grateful to the Foreign Secretary for that answer. It was reported recently that the Prime Minister has assured President Biden that an agreement will be reached with the EU in time for the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. We also read that the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill is on ice while the negotiations continue. Can the Foreign Secretary assure the House that if an agreement with the EU is reached, and we all hope it will happen, that the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill will be dropped?
Well, the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill exists for a reason. The commitment that I made to Maroš Šefčovič in the conversations that I had with him and with others is that we would not either artificially accelerate that process or artificially hinder or retard that process. We have always said that our preferred option is through negotiations. We speak regularly, the tone is positive, and I think that there is now an understanding that the concerns that we have raised, and have been raised particularly by the unionist community in Northern Ireland, are not confected, that they are real, and that any agreement would need to address them.
Paisley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Isn't it the case, Foreign Secretary, that there has not been 1 hour of actual negotiations because the EU has not extended its mandate to allow for any changes whatsoever in the operation of the current protocol? That being the case, does he not believe that the EU smells weakness in this government if they take their foot off the pedal with regards to the protocol bill in the other place? I would encourage the Foreign Secretary to press on with the protocol bill.
Foreign Secretary.
I can assure the honourable gentleman that the UK negotiating team are very, very conscious of the frustrations, particularly in the unionist community in Northern Ireland. But we've also made the point to our interlocutors in the EU that cross communities in Northern Ireland, there is a recognition that the protocol is not working, that it needs to be addressed, and that the relationship between Northern Ireland and Ireland, and the relationship between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK, of which Northern Ireland is a part, all have to function properly. That's the underpinning of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and that's what we seek to achieve through our negotiations.
Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One only needs to visit the port at Belfast and see the potential for new facilities there to realise the interruption there could be to the vital east-west trade routes that Northern Ireland relies upon. Would he agree, therefore, it's vital that the government is clear that we do not take anything off the table in terms of coming to an agreement? Even though we do want to see an agreement, we do need to still have on the table all the options to ensure we get what we need for the United Kingdom.
Foreign Secretary.
The United Kingdom's position has been consistent. That we recognise that the way the protocol is working is undermining community cohesion in Northern Ireland. It is disrupting business flows, particularly east-west between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. These issues have to be addressed. That is, I think, something the EU negotiating team understand, and we will continue negotiating in good faith. But as I say, the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill exists for a reason. We want to ensure that we get a good working resolution that's sustainable for all the communities in Northern Ireland.
Shadow Foreign Secretary David Lammy.
Well, can I say to the Secretary of State that for 18 months we've been at an impasse on the Northern Ireland Protocol, and instead of negotiations we've had cheap rhetoric and threats to break agreements. With a UK government showing determination and diplomatic skill and an EU willing to be flexible, these problems are easily resolvable. Is the real problem that the Prime Minister's in the pocket of the ERG, too weak to stand up to his backbenchers and put his party before Northern Ireland?
Foreign Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman needs to keep up. We have had very well-tempered negotiations between the UK and the EU negotiators. Actually, he will find that in our public reporting of those negotiations, there has been a high degree of mutual respect. And he says there's an easy resolution. All I would say, if he believes there is an easy resolution, is we're waiting to hear it. If it were easy, it would have been done already.
Well, let's hear SNP spokesperson Alan Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would commend the Foreign Secretary. If politics goes wrong for him, he's got a great career in stand-up ahead of him. That's fabulous. But this discussion is not happening in a vacuum, and the Foreign Secretary will be aware of the people in Northern Ireland. A poll in the Irish Times just yesterday, 54% of the people of Northern Ireland are in favour of EU membership. Now, I want to see a negotiated outcome over the protocol. We all do. There are things with the protocol that do need to be addressed. We all agree on that. The protocol bill is not the way to do that. Yeah. Surely he now has to recognise that it's the biggest block to progress on these talks, and now's the time to scrap it.
Mr. Speaker, I'm the one who's been in the conversations with the EU. I know that they don't particularly like the Northern Ireland Protocol bill, but nevertheless, the conversations that I have had with my direct interlocutors and our officials have been having with their opposite numbers in the EU system have been progressing. As I say, there are still a number of serious issues that need to be resolved, but we are working in good faith. But as I say, the bill exists for a reason, and it is important that is there. I welcome the fact that he highlights that there is a pretty much now universal agreement that the protocol needs to be changed, because that is what is driving an increased degree of community tension in Northern Ireland and disruption. And whilst I'm at my feet, I welcome his resumption in his place.
Under Stafford.
5, please, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.